Hey, Chris here for Conservation Cooperative. Have you ever caught yourself saying or doing something exactly like your parents? It's happening to me more and more. You might be wondering, how does this relate to a podcast about conservation? Well, when I was a kid, my dad would pull over to the side of the road anytime he saw a turtle attempting to cross, especially snapping turtles. This could be on the way to school, to an appointment, or when we were already running late for something. Yeah, I'm doing the same thing now. I think my kids thought it was really cool at first, but as they've gotten older and now have places to be themselves, they just are not as into it. I can't help it though. In the case of snappers, nature is driving females to leave their aquatic environment where basically nothing messes with them, to then have to contend with a totally unnatural landscape fraught with peril. Walls, fences, buildings, pavement, and of course, automobiles, which often is where their journey ends. I suspect there are a lot of people like my dad and I out there who are compelled to take some level of action when they see an animal crossing the road, whether that be simply slowing down for a moment or doing a little bit more. Whether it's compassion, confronting a sense of our own mortality, or something along the lines of a recognition of the intersection between the human and animal worlds. That intersection is one that we as hunters and anglers know all too well. I mean, let's be honest, we're kind of sensitive to the loss of habitat in those wild places we like to linger in. That sensitivity is one of the reasons why BHA chapters around the country and right here in the Northeast are interested in supporting sensible policy for the research and construction of wildlife crossings. The New York chapter, along with a broad coalition of other groups, are on the cusp of seeing a wildlife crossing bill become law. In this episode of the Conservation Cooperative, we're going to look at how roads impact wildlife, the role that wildlife crossings can play on the landscape, and how this bill could make a big impact for both animals and people. Born and raised in New York, award-winning environmental journalist Ben Goldfarb literally wrote the book on road ecology and wildlife crossings.
Roads affect animals in all kinds of different ways. Direct mortality is the most conspicuous way that roads affect wildlife. And, we've all, of course, seen the dead deer or moose or other critter by the side of the road. And we know that that's a really a population level impact for so many species around the country and the world. But, in so many ways, that's the tip of the iceberg, right? Roads aren't just killing animals directly, they're preventing animals from moving around the landscape. Those indirect sort of sublethal effects can almost in some cases be worse than roadkill itself.
In his book Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, Goldfarb travels around the world to investigate how roads are transforming the planet and impacting wildlife.
We know that moving fence of traffic prevents animals from reaching habitat and mates and shelter and food and all the things that every organism needs. We know that for mountain lions in California, roads are causing this genetic fragmentation that's leading to inbreeding and genetic defects and long-term decline of many populations there. And certainly that's happening in New York as well. Black bears and fishers and bobcats, all of the fauna of the Northeast. Those sublethal effects, I think are really insidious. You might never see a mountain lion carcass by the side of the highway. That doesn't mean that roads aren't having enormous impacts on their habitat use and their genetics and their ability to survive long term.
Simply put, the impacts of roads on wildlife extend far beyond what we can see while driving. In fact, if we slow down, we would see a whole lot more.
My name's Kate Cleary. I'm an assistant professor in environmental studies at SUNY Potsdam in Potsdam, New York. And I've been there for about 5 years, but before I lived in Potsdam, I lived all over the country and Central America. And my research has always been on wildlife movement through complex landscapes, human-dominated landscapes.
Through her work at SUNY Potsdam and as acting president of the Algonquin to Adirondack Collaborative, Professor Cleary has been actively studying some of the unique road ecology and connectivity issues of northern New York. One of those studies is conducted on bicycle and is entering into its second season. During that first season, Cleary and her team recorded some pretty staggering roadkill numbers.
So we go twice a week for 7 weeks on a 12-mile stretch of road. So the 12-mile stretch of Route 12 and a 12-mile stretch of Route 37, almost 800 dead animals in 14 surveys. And I don't have the percentages on the tip of my tongue, but it was close to 70% frogs. And then the next largest group would be turtles, including not an overwhelming amount, but several endangered Blandings turtles that we found killed on those roads.
After turtles were birds, and coming in about 7% were mammals. Due to the fact that the Department of Transportation promptly removes large mammals like deer from the roadway, she has partnered with the agency, who are recording the frequency and location of deer, moose, bears, and other large mammals struck and killed by vehicles. Keep in mind, we're only talking about two 12-mile sections of road in northern New York over a 7-week period. That's barely 0.01% of the 114,424 miles of roads in the state. Consider that, according to the New York Department of Transportation, there are over 65,000 reported deer collisions a year in New York. Besides the obvious danger of striking a deer while driving, it's also expensive, with most collisions costing between $20,000 and $40,000. With animals seemingly crossing everywhere, where do you even begin? Here's Ben Goldfarb again.
I think a lot about the geography of wildlife crossings, right? These are really technologies that began in the American West. The key thing about the West is that, there are these large herds of migratory ungulates that move across the landscape in very predictable routes. We've got mule deer and elk and pronghorn and, in some cases even moose migrating. And when you get 1,000 mule deer crossing a highway in Wyoming at the same place every single year, and, there's this big pile of 50 carcasses in some places saying, hey, put a wildlife crossing right here, right? And, I think for a long time, there was this perception in the Northeast that wildlife crossings didn't really make sense in an Eastern context, right? Because, white-tailed deer all over the place all the time. There aren't hot spots in the same way, or, everywhere's a hot spot. And so it's, it's hard to mitigate discrete locations. And so I think that lots of DOTs historically had that mindset that, okay, wildlife crossings are great for those guys in the West, but, they don't make sense in an Eastern landscape. And I think that's fortunately starting to change. I think that part of the reason that's changing is research that was done in Virginia on I-64, showing very clearly that you can basically fence highways, direct white-tailed deer to crossing locations, including existing box culverts that were already on the landscape, and prevent a lot of collisions and save the public a lot of money that way, while allowing not only deer, but also foxes and bears and opossums and all kinds of critters to keep moving around the landscape. And so I'm really excited to see that myth start to break down.
I asked Professor Cleary if she's observed certain characteristics in the road's location or design that tend to have higher concentrations of roadkill in areas where she was studying.
So what we tend to see is some predictable things. So where there's wetlands on either side of the road, it's just like a massacre, a turtle and frog massacre. If there's wetlands on both sides of the roads, especially, and that's fairly well known, for amphibians. But one other thing I found was really surprising is when you have an area where the road has cut through like a rock formation, and so the engineers had to cut away the cliff, and there's like these little cliffs on either side, And then there's a ditch that they dug so the water will drain off the road and down. That's a murder scene. And I never would have thought that. I would have thought those would be the places where you'd have very little roadkill because there's, 30-foot cliffs on either side of the road. But actually, what it looks like happens is, especially frogs go in those ditches because it's wet and there's water. Even on very dry days, there's still water in there. There were a few days where there was rain, and then we went out a few days later and we documented like 87 frogs dead in like a 1 mile stretch. So, I mean, that those types of features, I honestly think there's like a fairly simple solution, which is you need a drainage ditch completely, but like put up a drift fence on either side of where the cliff is cut out so that animals can't get in there. So that's something I wouldn't have expected. That's been surprising and that I think would be fairly inexpensive to mitigate.
All right, so roads fragment habitat and restrict the movement of wildlife across the landscape. Oh, and of course, they can be really dangerous for both wildlife and humans. So, what can we do about it? Well, the New York Wildlife Crossing Act is a great starting point. In a nutshell, the bill would empower key state agencies to engage in projects that facilitate public safety improvements for drivers and safe passage for wildlife by considering locations for wildlife crossing construction. As we've already heard, work in that area is underway throughout the state. The good news is the bill has already passed through the New York legislature and is now on Governor Hochul's desk. Meet Aaron Cito, the U.S. Public Policy Director with Wildlands Network, an organization that focuses on habitat connectivity.
I think it's a very tame bill in terms of what it requires the agencies to do, but it is asking the agencies to take a statewide look to figure out their priorities for wildlife crossings, which I think no matter where you are in the country is important because those states with those publicly identified priorities are able to leverage public-private partnerships to implement projects on the ground. They're able to attract federal dollars to projects. So the New York Wildlife Crossing Act is really trying to help the agencies attract some of the unprecedented federal dollars that we're seeing right now through the last infrastructure bill. So New York doesn't get left behind and can help protect wildlife because New York is the biggest state in the Northeast. So if it can accomplish this bill, it takes up a huge amount of what we, call the Eastern Wildway at Wildlands Network. So really, if this bill gets signed by the governor by the end of the year, it's just going to have a tremendous impact for wildlife in the Northeast.
While New York lawmakers were ultimately receptive to the need and practicality of the bill, advocates for wildlife crossings definitely had to do some education and outreach around the issue.
Brian Berg, and I am the chapter coordinator for New York, New Jersey, and New England.
Brian represented New York BHA in the State House and met with individual lawmakers in an effort to help them to better understand the issues and the mechanics of the bill. As is often the case with this type of outreach, clearing up misconceptions was a big part of it.
And so I think if I would say that probably one of the biggest barriers of why somebody would be against something like this would be money. And really, it doesn't have to be that way. It's amazing because it doesn't take much financially to address crossings and to facilitate crossings. It could be as simple as they call them directional fences. It's kind of fences that are angled in certain ways to kind of steer the critters to go to a certain spot where it's a little bit safer.
When wildlife crossings are implemented correctly and put in the right places, over time, they can pay for themselves. Aaron Cito explains.
I think a lot of time when you see these big dollar amounts associated with wildlife crossings, particularly out west, we do find that these projects can recuperate the costs associated with building them over time. The thing that's great about the East Coast is when you look at these smaller crossings that are available, if deer are using them too, you can recuperate those costs a lot faster if you're looking at just fencing existing culverts, for example. We've seen some really great examples in Virginia where they just put some directional fencing at existing culverts that were large enough to accommodate deer passage in some hotspot areas for vehicle collisions. And they were able to recuperate the costs of all of that fencing within 2 years. So the project paid for itself. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, because of all the built infrastructure that we already have here in the East Coast to sort of recuperate some of the very expensive costs that we're seeing with our wildlife vehicle collision problem out here.
One of the big questions I kept returning to as I explored this issue was, given the political climate we are in, does society value wildlife enough to come together and invest in infrastructure to help and protect it? Professor Kate Cleary again.
The country has become so divided. And one thing I love about wildlife is it really brings together very different groups of people who could have very different political beliefs. And it's because wildlife cuts across a lot of different demographics and is appealing to a lot of people. So I think that's optimistic. I think we can be optimistic and say that people are starting to realize the impact of road infrastructure on wildlife and starting to address it.
Ben Goldfarb shared a similar perspective.
One of the awesome things about wildlife crossings is, they just unite these groups across really broad spectrums of values and interests in politics. They're truly nonpartisan in a way that, so few environmental solutions are. In Wyoming, it was the hunting lobby, the mule deer fanatics, who really have raised so much funding and awareness for wildlife crossings. In Colorado, there was recently some polling that showed that 85% of residents support more wildlife crossings. And, you couldn't get 85% of residents to agree that the sky is blue, right? So it's just, it's just really, really incredible how, these wildlife crossings, just as they bridge habitats and cross freeways, they also bridge political lines and lines of value and interest. And I think that's one of the really powerful things about them. I can't think of another environmental issue that unites, the hunting lobby and the Humane Society,
We hope that the governor recognizes not just the broad support for this initiative, but also the value it has for animals and people alike. Stay tuned for updates on this issue by connecting with the New York chapter on social media or through the chapter's monthly newsletter. You'll automatically get that with your membership, or you can sign up for the newsletter on our website. I'll be sure to put details in the description of this episode on how to do so. Huge thank you to our guests, Ben Goldfarb, Kate Cleary, Aaron Cito, and of course, our own Brian Bird. Go pick up a copy of Ben's book, Crossings. You can find that on his website or wherever you buy books. Music for this episode is from Blue Dot Sessions. On behalf of the New York and New England chapters of BHA, thank you so much for listening. Stay in touch, keep tabs on our work, become a member, do all those things. Thanks again, and take care.